were up at Bryant and Abby's last night, and I slept on their couch, and I slept on the, you know how a couch has the, the armrest or whatever. Well, my head was on that armrest, with my neck was on the bottom pillow, so my neck is a little bit sore. So, doing that tonight's going to be fun to do that. But anyway, so we're okay. We're already ready. If you haven't already been making your way in your Bibles to Joshua chapter 5, we typically do this on Sunday morning, but since I'm going to be out of town, or as I'm going to be filling in at East Main this next Sunday, or this upcoming Sunday, we're gonna cover Joshua tonight. Again, this is Israel's test at Jericho, and honestly, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna twist that a little bit around, just so I'm not turning my head 100%. So, Brother Keith, I might be kind of in your way a little bit. So, if you wanted to slide over, if you were trying to look at that, that would greatly help me out. Okay. All right, so it's a little bit easier for me. Anyway, we are picking up in verse 13. So this is kind of a natural division. Well, kind of a natural division in a way, because the events of verses 13 through 15 really connect to the main part of chapter 6, which is obviously the Battle of Jericho. I've got this labeled Israel's Test at Jericho, and our plan is to try to get down through verse 7. And obviously we won't get through all the chapter, but our plan is to get down through verse 7. So with our key points tonight, there are a couple of things we want to think about. Number one, the Lord's power can invoke both. I'm sorry, I've got that on the wrong thing. God supports those who are trying to do His will. That may seem kind of obvious to us at times. At times it may not seem so obvious to us. That's certainly going to be kind of the crux of what's going on in the end of chapter 5, as we'll see with Joshua's interaction with a man that is rather mysterious. And obviously we'll kind of point out why that application is important then. And then the other thing, and this is more so connected to all of chapter 6, is just the simple concept, what is sensible in life? Well, ultimately the sensible path in life is simply doing what God says. And that's going to come out as one of the key issues that comes out of what happens in Joshua chapter 6 about what do you do now that you're on the verge of taking over. You're at the point of taking over the city of Jericho. And so we're going to look at both of these. We're going to do a better job of tying these key points in as we and how they actually fit into what we're talking about as we go through this. But I won't have somebody read for us. If you would, read Joshua chapter 5, verses 13 through 15.
It came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man opposite him with a sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went unto him and said unto him, Art thou for us, or for our adversaries? And he said, No, but as captain of the Lord of hosts am I now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and did worship, and said to him, What saith my Lord unto his servant? And the captain of the Lord's host said to Joshua, Take thy shoe from off thy foot, the place whereon thou standest is holy. And Joshua did so.
All right, so we notice in verse 13, and keep in mind that in we've already talked about in chapter 5, right, the people have been circumcised who had not been circumcised. That's going to be tied in, I think, to what happens here. But the people, again, who had not been circumcised, they've been circumcised. They've done, exactly as the Lord commanded. Again, now that they are about to enter into the land that was promised in the covenant, again, keep in mind circumcision was a sign of faithfully keeping the covenant and the law of Moses. We know, of course, that the Passover has already occurred. The people have already had the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Again, enough time has elapsed, obviously, for the men to recover from the process of circumcision. And, that's already happened. Well, now in verse 13, we've got a situation in which it says that, again, the phrase that it came to pass is, shortly there after the events of verse 12, that Joshua was by Jericho. So Joshua, for whatever reason, approaches Jericho. Keep in mind that the people are camped in the vicinity of what becomes the city of Gilgal in Israel. And you read throughout the book of Joshua that a lot of times Gilgal is kind of the base of operation for the Israelites. And so when they go out and they will, conquer other parts of Canaan, that they a lot of times begin at Gilgal and then go out. Gilgal itself, we know, is going to be very close to Jericho. We talked about that when it came to the Jordan River, that the Israelites perhaps crossed north of where Jericho was along the Jordan River, and then eventually encamped in Gilgal, and now within the proximity of Jericho. Verse 13 does not tell us exactly what Joshua is doing here. We know, based on what we talked about in our introduction, that Joshua is a military man. He essentially served as a general under Moses. And naturally, any type of general in preparing for battle kind of wants a good idea about the terrain of the land. We know that Joshua has sent out spies back in chapter 2 to give him a report from Jericho. And so Joshua in that passage had not seen it for himself. So maybe he's out scouting information for himself. Maybe he's looking to see the land for himself. And for whatever reason, that doesn't become important because, again, as it says in verse 13, it says that he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood opposite with him with his sword drawn in his hand. And it says that Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And so naturally, this is a very pertinent question because Joshua knows that battle is on the horizon. We're going to see, based on chapter 6 and verse 1, that the people of Jericho essentially know that war is on the horizon based on their own response to the Israelites' presence. And so, this is a natural question for Joshua to ask. Is this man one of the Canaanites that he's about to destroy? As we see in verse 13, his sword is drawn. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But this is a natural question. This is somebody that Joshua had never met before, and trying to figure out his identity is also important because, again, of God's command that when it comes to the conquest of Canaan, the idea is that all the Canaanites are eliminated, which could perhaps be this individual. And so this question is not out of the ordinary for somebody to ask, especially with the fact, again, that the man has his sword drawn. But of course, we've read from verses 13 through 15 here, this is not an ordinary individual. Again, verse 14, the response is that this man is the commander of the army of the Lord. Again, no name that's attached to it. We keep in mind that essentially Joshua has acted as a general for God's army, so to speak, for the Israelites. And so, Joshua is the leader and as a military leader under Moses, now the overall leader of his people. In a lot of ways, Joshua perhaps saw himself as the commander of the Lord's army because he was leading them in, again, his military experience. And so it's a rather interesting way of identifying yourself. And so let's talk about the identity because, again, his name is not given to us. And that makes this passage one that a lot of people like to read about because, again, there's some uncertainty about exactly who this is. No names attached. And so there are different ideas exactly about, who this person really is. There are really two main considerations, I think, when it comes to his identity. Some would say that perhaps this is an angel. We know that angels essentially can have military power. I know in Jude chapter 1 and verse 9, we read about Michael, the archangel, contending with the devil over the body of Moses. I know that passage is a reference. There are a couple of passages in the book of Daniel that reference Michael as perhaps Michael as a military, an angel connected to military power, so to speak. And some people would some people would say maybe this is an angel that is talking to Joshua. Probably a better answer to this, at least in my opinion, is actually that this is Jesus prior to his coming to the earth. We know that there are several instances in the Old Testament where God appeared to men, and you're not 100% certain about this, but there are a lot of people that seem to think that this is certainly God's presence, but perhaps even Jesus himself, just prior to his physical coming to the earth in terms of being made into a man that's referred to in Philippians 2. And there's one other passage I don't have listed up here that we want to look at, but why this perhaps might be Jesus could be based on a couple of passages. If somebody would read for us Revelation 22, verses 8 and 9. So in that passage, John falls before and tries to worship who or what? An angel. And what does the angel do in that passage? He kind of softly rebukes John, right? Tells him, don't fall down and worship me. Right? And that's the point in that passage, is obviously John's not supposed to worship the angels himself, because the angels themselves are simply ministers in the same way that he was for the purposes of God. And so he's kind of softly rebuked in that passage. Well, again, you notice here that Joshua, right, in verse 14, after he learns this is the commander of the army of the Lord, it simply says that he fell on his face to the earth and worshiped and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" How does the commander of the army of the Lord respond to Joshua in this passage? Take your sandal off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy. What you notice there is he's not rebuked for doing that in the same way that John was. And so perhaps that is an indication here that this is not simply an angel that's being referred to. And sometimes we see other times in the Old Testament where angels are responsible for killing a lot of the enemies of God. But here we notice that Joshua is not rebuked for it. And so that would give an indication that this is not an angel that is communicating with Joshua, but as some seem to think, possibly Jesus before, again, his birth in the book of in the gospel accounts. In Matthew chapter, we won't look at this passage in detail, but in Matthew 26 and verse 53, when Jesus was basically rebuking his disciples for trying to violently defend him from being arrested, what did Jesus tell his disciples that he could do to protect himself? Yeah, he said that Jesus said, I could call on, I could request to my Father for 12 legions of angels to defend myself. And again, that would suggest someone who has some type of military control. And that's just another idea, again, that might reflect that this is Jesus as well. The other passage that I don't have up here that I wanted to look at is the passage that Tanya just referenced, and that is Exodus 3. Because in Exodus 3, again, this is a very similar occasion to what happened with Moses. And we know that Moses at this point has fled from Pharaoh. He's fled into Midian. And while he is tending to the flock, somebody read for us verse 2 and read down through verse 5. Exodus 3, verses 2 through 5.
So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed.
So you notice here, right, an angel of the Lord communicates to Moses, and it says that God called out to him from the bush. We certainly understand here, right, this identifies that this is God talking directly to Moses. And again, notice that the statement is used, and I should have asked you, but read verse 6 as well.
Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God.
So notice that, again, the identification here is, I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Moses naturally is, somewhat afraid of having learned that. But do you remember what Jesus said in John chapter 8 concerning Abraham and himself? Yeah, in John chapter 8, when Jesus is talking about his identity in that passage, it's interesting that he says that before Abraham was, I am. And notice that in Exodus 3 and verse 6, God identifies himself again by that phrase, I am, or I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So that's why a lot of people would seem to suggest that in Joshua chapter 5, that this is really, this is God directly communicating to Joshua, and perhaps again again Jesus prior to his birth in the New Testament. Whatever the case may be, again, that's just different ideas. I tend to lean more towards the latter there, but whatever it means, what Joshua understands, though, based on verse 13, is this is an individual who's ready for war. Again, it says that verse 13, it said that a man stood opposite him, not beside him, but he looked out and saw a man opposite him with his sword drawn. And you read about that phrase, the sword drawn, in two different other places in the Old Testament. One of those comes in Numbers chapter 22 and verse 23, where, again, Balaam was called to curse the people of God in that passage, and he was on his way to do that, and the donkey, right, Balaam was with his donkey, and the donkey stopped, because what did the donkey see that Balaam did not? Yeah, he saw an angel of the Lord with the sword drawn, right, which would indicate he's about to be attacked. 1 Chronicles 21 and verse 16, David saw God essentially with his sword drawn, about to strike Jerusalem because David had disobeyed God. And so the understanding is that this person naturally means business. And so trying to figure out why his sword is drawn is of utmost importance to Joshua. And we notice here that the commander, when it comes to his answer, right, his question, Joshua's question was, are you for us or for our adversaries? And the commander's answer is, he doesn't really answer, right? Are you for us or for our enemies? And all the commander says, no, I'm the commander of the army of the Lord. I've now come. Sometimes it gets kind of annoying if you ask somebody a question, they don't answer the question, right? Or they give you an answer, but it's not actually answering your question. And that's kind of what's happening here. The commander of the army of the Lord gives his identity, but he doesn't directly answer this question, are you for us or for our adversaries? And that is a very important point to make in light of the next two chapters. Again, the question that Joshua should not be asking the question, essentially, is God for us or is he for our adversaries? But in reality, the question that should be asked is, the real question here is, what is Israel's allegiance towards God? Are you for us or for our adversaries? Because here's the thing, God's position on an issue is always consistent, right? God's position on an issue is right to do what is right. God doesn't make mistakes. God's going to do whatever is right. And so, again, if this is the commander of the army of the Lord, he represents the Lord. The real question is not, is God for us or is God going to be for our adversaries? It's really about, what is the allegiance of the people. God already knows, or God's already got his mind made up about what he's going to do. But the question is really more so, what is the people's mindset towards God? Because see, here's the thing. When you think about what happens in the next 2 chapters, that's where this comes into play. Chapter 6, God is essentially for his people. But in chapter 7, when it comes to the first attempt to defeat Ai, the city of Ai, who was God for, essentially in that passage? Yeah, he was on the side of Ai, right? In other words, he was willing to defend Ai because of Achan's sin. And that's why the answer to Joshua's question is not so clear-cut. At times, yes, he helps God's people. At times, he does not help God's people, because the real question is, where is Israel's allegiance? And that's the real question on this issue. If somebody would read for us Exodus 23, verses 20 through 23. We're not going to read the other 2 passages, but I do want to read that passage because it directly connects to this instance between this individual and Joshua.
Behold, I send an angel before thee to keep thee in the way and to bring thee into the place which I have prepared. Beware of him and obey his voice, provoke him not, for he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him. If thou shalt indeed obey his voice and do all that I speak, then I will be an enemy unto thine enemies, and an adversary unto thine adversaries. For mine angel shall go before thee, and bring thee in unto the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I will cut them off.
So again, that passage is, from an earlier time period where, again, God reiterates the fact that an angel of the Lord is going to go before you and help you conquer the land of Canaan. But what's the condition there? Yeah, they have to obey his voice. And that's kind of the point that the commander of the army is getting across here, right? God's purpose is already determined. God's already made up his mind about what side he's on. It's really in determination for the people to determine what side are they on. You think back to Romans 8 and verse 31. This is perhaps a very famous passage that a lot of people can remember. But can anybody tell us what exactly that verse says? If God be for us, who can be against us? But what word is important in that verse? Right, that word if is important, right? If God be for us, who can be against us? Because what does the word if imply in that statement? It's a conditional statement. It also means that if we don't meet the condition, or we're not doing the part to meet the conditions, then God's not for us, right? If God be for us, who can be against us? And again, Paul addresses in Romans 8, in the book of Romans, exactly what does it mean to have the Lord on your side, so to speak. I thought about this situation. I thought about Lincoln's second inaugural address. He had this to say about, as an overview of the Civil War, talking about how both sides prayed to God to win the battle. And this is what he had to say. He said, each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible and prayed to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any man should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been fully answered. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. And that was kind of his point, is both people wanted, both sides wanted 2 different things, both prayed to the same God. And so, both sides were trying to argue God was for our side, and Abraham Lincoln was saying that in the purposes of God, it may not have been that clear. But the point is that the people had to get their mind made up about what they were going to do. Again, Romans 8 verse 31 is a good example of that. And we notice that based on Joshua's own response here, he fell to the earth, he worshiped him, addresses him as Lord, as the term Adonai, tell me what to do. And as the commander of the Lord's army said, take your sandal off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy, and Joshua did so. So in other words, Joshua recognizes now, what the Lord will do. Joshua is showing that he is going to get behind what the Lord's plans are, right? Joshua is making his allegiance known in light of that. Again, thinking back to what is said in Exodus 23, where God was very clear that in the conquest of Canaan, the angel of the Lord would go before them to help them conquer the land, as long as they obeyed his voice. So this is why we think about this as God's test for Israel. Joshua passes the test, and chapter 6 is going to focus on, do the people then pass the test by following through with what he wants. And so the point for us from verses 13 and 15 is simply that God will support those who do his will. If we do not do his will, it doesn't matter if we call ourselves a Christian, but if we stop doing his will, God's not going to support us in that way. Again, we could tie in 1 John 1 and verse 7 in this context, right? If we walk in the light as he is in the light, the blood of Christ his Son cleanses us from all our sins. If we walk in the light as he is in the light. In other words, if we are trying to do his will, God supports us. The blood of Christ cleanses us from our sins, is the application we could think about here. So let's talk about the situation in Jericho now. Verse 1, it says that Jericho was securely shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out and none came in. So what we notice now is that the city itself is on high alert. We know because the people are aware of what's happened to Israel's past enemies. Again, we're told that all have essentially gathered inside. This is a computer artist generation of creation of perhaps what the city of Jericho may have looked like. One thing that you may not recognize here is that a lot of times, even around walled cities, they had land outside the walled cities that were for agriculture. And so when it talks about how the city was securely shut, the idea is that even the people who lived on the outskirts of the wall that tended to agriculture, they're also kind of inside the city as well, which is why, again, none went out and none came in. The spies had already been able to get in, and so there's a lot tighter security to make sure no one's leaving and no one is coming in. Again, this is a walled city, and this is going to be a new challenge for the Israelites. Again, when they wandered in the wilderness, there were times where they did have to deal with enemies like the Amalekites, but those individuals were nomadic. They didn't necessarily have the walled cities like what the Canaanites would have had. And so this is a relatively new challenge for Joshua. It's a new challenge for the Israelites in terms of, just from a military perspective, dealing with a new challenge. And how do you respond to that? Well, what do you do in this situation? We'll look at verses 2 through 7 in a minute. What is the sensible approach? Well, when you think about how sometimes battles took place in this situation, where you do have you got one army, one people behind a wall or a major defense like that, sometimes a sensible approach might be a direct attack. Obviously, a direct attack would be, you're trying to get this over as quickly as possible, but you're also perhaps sacrificing a lot of men in the process of it. In order for this process to work, a sensible approach would be, you got to have enough manpower to climb over the walls and basically kill the inhabitants in that area. If you look at the PowerPoint, the image itself is a reference to a situation in which this approach did work, right? And what is that a picture of on the screen? The Alamo, right? The Alamo was a case in which the Texans and the Mexicans who supported Texas independence from Mexico, right, gathered in the Alamo. They, built up the defenses around it, and basically the Mexican army's approach was they stormed the Alamo and eventually captured it. But of course, lost a lot of men in the process of it. Sometimes that works. In other cases, that strategy doesn't work. There's a very famous, scenario where, well, I was going to say, yesterday marked the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill in the Revolutionary War. The British tried kind of the same approach as the Mexican army did here. And they suffered a lot of casualties, but they were able to take the hill. But in the War of 1812, the British tried a similar approach when it came to New Orleans, which the Americans held. And the British tried to breach through the walls, not stone walls perhaps like what Jericho had, but they tried to breach through the walls around New Orleans. And the British soldiers got up to the walls, and the commander who was in charge of that part of the operation, guess what he forgot that was necessary to climb over the walls? The ladder. It was his responsibility to make sure that his men had the ladders to put up so that they could climb over the walls, because you got to, to win, you got to get over the wall. And the guy forgot the ladder, and so it was a disaster. But sometimes it doesn't work. That's certainly an approach that would be sensible if you have the manpower to do that. And a lot of people seem to think that the Israelites at this point in their manpower greatly outnumbered the inhabitants of Jericho. The other sensible approach in this situation would be to simply lay siege and kind of wait them out. In Deuteronomy 20, verses 19 through 20, this approach is what God talks about specifically when it comes to some of the cities in Canaan. Now, I'm going to read that real quick. But Deuteronomy 20 talks a lot about how the Israelites were to conduct war. And we're actually going to come back to this next week, this chapter next week. But at the end of verse 20, or at the end of chapter 20, beginning in verse 19, the command was given, when you besiege a city for a long time, while making war against it to take it, you shall not destroy its trees by wielding an axe against them, if you can eat of them. Do not cut them down to use in the siege, for the tree of the field is man's food. Only the trees which you know are not trees for food, you may destroy and cut down to build siege works against the city that makes war with you until it is subdued. And this is basically what the Israelites are essentially facing here. You've got all the enemy combatants who are trapped again. I'll go ahead and move to the next slide. They're all contained within this wall city, and the sensible approach could be, we'll just wait them out. We'll lay siege to the city. Once we starve them out enough, we'll use the trees around the area to build up siege works, basically either to get over the wall or to bust through the gate. Those two things would have been the sensible approach if you were to ask a military commander, how do we get the city of Jericho to surrender to us? But in verses 2 through 7, essentially, what is God's message about how the city is going to fall? How are they going to win this battle? Yeah, verse 3, it says that you shall march around the city, all you men of war. You shall go all around the city once. This you shall do 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. But the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And it shall come to pass, when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, that all the people shall shout with a great shout. Then the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up, every man straight before him. So in other words, again, the men of war, led by the priests, are going to march around the city once for 6 days. The 7 priests bearing the horns will blow the horns. On the 7th day, they will march around the city 7 times. The priests will blow the horns, the people will shout, and the walls will come down. Now, if you were to give that as an explanation to any type of military commander who had a ton of experience laying siege to a city, what would he say? It's crazy, right? He would suggest that you're out of mind. He may kick you out of the military, right? Because you might be quarantined in a way because you think you're out of your mind. But see, here's the thing about it. It doesn't matter whatever military strategy somebody came up with, verse 2 kind of gives us what the sensible approach was. And that is verse 2, where the Lord said to Joshua, and perhaps this is the commander of the Lord's army who is still talking to Joshua here. See, I have given Jericho into your hand, its king and the mighty men of valor. Again, you notice that phrase, I've given Jericho into your hand, its king, and the mighty men of valor. In other words, this battle is already determined, is what the Lord is saying here, right? You draw up military strategies thinking about, this is the best way to conquer a city. We can come up with a plan B if necessary. But what God's saying here is there's no need for a plan B because it's already going to happen. It's as though it's almost already happened. I have given Jericho into your hand. Again, the plan itself defied what we would consider to be conventional military wisdom. No commander, no person who had any experience, even a private at the very lowest level, would ever think that this would be a plan that would work. But here's the thing that we see frequently in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. There are a lot of things that don't make sense, but the reason why they make sense is because God said that this will work if you do it. And I know you think about a number of examples that tie in here. Obviously you think about Naaman. Naaman didn't think that it was sensible to go wash himself in the Jordan River. We know that there are other instances of that. But the point that God's making here is that when it comes to, again, the people's allegiance, this may not make sense, but in a physical sense, but it's always the sensible approach to do exactly as what God says. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul kind of uses the same idea to talk about the Christians in Corinth who obeyed the gospel. When Paul talked about that the preaching of the cross, what did the world count that as? Yeah, in 1 Corinthians 1 and 18, Paul said that the preaching of the cross was foolishness to them that perish. No doubt the people of Jericho, perhaps when they saw this take place, and they went around marching the city, the people within the city thought, well, this is foolish. This is dumb. Why are they doing this? Not realizing that they were doing exactly as what God said, right? They were about to perish. They considered what the Israelites were doing perhaps as a very foolish activity. Just as a lot of people who choose not to obey the gospel and watch Christians do that and sacrifice a lot of their lives to follow after the gospel, a lot of people in the world look at that lifestyle and say it's foolish. It doesn't make sense. When in reality, why is it that we decide to follow the gospel and do exactly as God said? It's not foolish, but also because it saves us, right? It gives us victory, as 1 Corinthians 15 indicates. Well, because the people of God, again, are going to respond correctly here about their allegiance and doing this, what it's indicating here is that the people are saved by going through an approach that the world would consider to be foolishness. But it's not foolish because this is what God said to do. And when they did it, it was successful. This is a great lesson to apply to anything that we do as Christians today. I know a lot of times we can apply this again to, people bring up the consideration, why is baptism important to salvation? It doesn't seem to make sense to have to include baptism as a necessary step. But again, we remind ourselves is that if the New Testament shows us clearly for Christians to become, for individuals to become Christians, that baptism was a part of that process, that's what God said. Doesn't matter what we think, it's the sensible approach to anything. And that's what the people are, that's what's being put to the test here. And so, are there any comments or questions before we draw to a close tonight?
This speaks very well of their faith. Again, like you say,
Right.
it defies conventional And it shows that, they've learned their lesson, at least. Of course, they, no doubt, probably saw the younger ones, saw the older ones in the wilderness dying.
Right.
So, we don't want that happening to us. So they give a lot of faith on the part of them to follow the plan.
Absolutely. Right. We'll see that play out when we look at what happens at Jericho a week from Sunday. But again, thank you for your time and your attention tonight.